Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to my JavaScript Crash Course for Beginners series. What I'm going to talk about today is JavaScript functions, explained in a simple and easy to follow way. Specifically, what I'll cover is what a function is, how they're typically declared in JavaScript, how and why you'd normally use functions, and of course, like always, a bunch of examples as I go along in the code to make things super duper clear to everyone. As you can see, I'm using the same setup I always do. We'll use the terminal window here to go launch the Python server. I'll just go do that now. Let's go here and there we go. And that'll just let us host the files and run this from the browser. I've already got Atom open here, and I've created a new project, JavaScript Beginners 4, and I've got Chrome here. We'll just open the developer tab. Got the console here. And lastly, we should go navigate to localhost. If you haven't already, check out my first video in the series, which covers environment setup, if you want to follow along exactly the same way I do it. Feel free to skip this next part, because what I'm going to talk about is functions, but in a more abstract way, because, well, JavaScript functions, for beginners, this might be really useful if, say, you've never done any programming before, but if you already have a grasp on the subject, then go ahead and skip a bit later in the video. So like I said, we're talking about functions, and the first thing we should go over is what exactly is a function. Now, if you remember back to the video where I described what a variable is an abstraction, a way to give a symbolic name to a piece of information. Said another way, a variable is like a container for some data that you want to store and refer to later. So if you're asking, like, what does that have to do with functions? The concepts are more similar than you think. So why am I talking about variables when we're talking about functions in this video? The concepts are more similar than you think. While a variable refers to a sort of container for a piece of data, a function is like a container, but instead of being for data, a function is like a container for a piece of code that you want to reuse over and over again, maybe in a different way or maybe in a different context. Let's take an example that shows how variables and functions operate together. You want to describe to someone how to calculate the tip at the end of a meal. So you tell them normally it's about 15% of the cost of the meal, although if service was really bad, maybe you give less, and if service was superb, maybe you give more. In that case, there's a few variables. There's the cost of the meal and the quality of the service. Let's just write those out. Cost of the meal and quality service. And let's give those names that look more like JavaScript variables. Cost, meal, quality of service. To calculate the tip, there's some steps to perform, and we use those variables to get the answer, how much should I tip? Let's write some, what I'll call pseudocode. It's not going to be real code. It's just intended to look like code, but you should be able to follow along in plain English. We'll call this thing the tip calculator. And if the quality of service was just okay, then tip maybe 15%. And the quality of service was great, then tip, let's say 30%. And if the quality of the service was just terrible, then tip. We'll be jerks here and we'll tip 0. So the total tip is the cost of meal times the tip that we decided. The function here is the repeatable steps. It's the steps involved in deciding how much to tip and then calculating the size of the tip based off of the cost of the meal. The function relies on a few variables, all of which change with every meal and with every person. And those variables are the cost of the meal and the quality of the service, or the perceived quality of the service. Is that clear to everyone? Looping back around, JavaScript functions, explained in other ways, that they're a way of wrapping up a piece of the code or a section of the code so that it can be used again in different contexts. in much the same way that the tipping calculation can now be reused by everyone at the table. They just need to input how much their meal cost, how good they thought the service was, and they get an answer. They get an answer of how much they should tip. In a lot of ways, a function is like a mini program. It's a small piece of the program that can be run over and over again in different ways. So now that we know what a function is, let's move on to how to declare a function in JavaScript. And there's a couple ways to define a function in JavaScript. If you're really curious, then I encourage you to visit the MDM web docs. That's Mozilla's comprehensive website on development documentation for web standards. And they have huge sections dedicated to JavaScript functionality, including stuff like browser compatibility, which is really nice. So you can see whether or not a feature of JavaScript is supported just on Chrome or just on Firefox or across a wide variety of browsers. Let's go and visit that right now. Go here. These are the MDN web docs from Mozilla. You can see that there's a big section here on functions, and it's very comprehensive here. But also, if we scroll up, you can see that we've got a lot of reference for not only functions, but all of JavaScript. And I use this extensively when I'm learning about JavaScript. All right, back to how to define a function in JavaScript. Like I said, there's a few ways, but I don't want to get too caught up in all that right now since you're new, so I'll teach you the most common form to start, and we'll work with that. At the end, I'll quickly show you a few of the other ways, and we won't go into much detail, as they require pretty much entire videos on their own. The important takeaway here is that you'll know how to declare a function, and if you see a different way in code, if you're reading someone else's code, you should be able to understand what's happening. Let's go and write some actual code. And what we'll do here is we'll write a function that does some console.log statements like we've been using before. So here we go. Let's just erase all of this stuff here. And function, write some stuff. And we'll just write something, doesn't matter. Hello, how are you? Now, to deconstruct what we actually wrote here, I started with the function keyword. So you can see the function keyword right here. And that's one of those reserved keywords in JavaScript. And what it does is it says that we're about to declare a function. Similar to how we used let, const, or var to declare variables, you use the function keyword to declare a JavaScript function. Then we follow that up with the name. So right here, we've got the name of the function. And again, this is exactly the same as when you declared variables. And finally, you can see between the two curly braces here, I've got the console.log statement. This is called the function body, and you can write a bunch of code here between those two curly braces. In fact, the same restrictions on naming variables also apply to naming functions. Now, if you missed that video, I encourage you to go back and watch it, but to summarize, you can use either an underscore or alphabetic characters to start. That's including capitals or lowercase. And then alphanumeric, like A to Z and 0 to 9, or underscores for the rest of the name. Let's go and run this now. Let's go in Chrome and hit reload. So you'll notice that nothing happened. And that's because all we did was declare a function. The program knows that the function exists now, like write some stuff exists. It's a thing in the program. But that's all it's doing, it's existing. There was no code actually run. So to make it run and execute and actually do something, this is called calling a function in JavaScript. And the way you call it is, let's just go to the code here and write some stuff. Then you add a parentheses afterwards. We'll get to y later, and then a semicolon. And then we just go and reload here. And there we go. Hello, how are you? You can see that it ran now because it printed out the hello, how are you that we added in the code before. And we can go and we can call this twice, for example. Let's just reload. And you can see that it printed out hello, how are you twice. So this is neat, but it's not doing a heck of a lot here. So let's add a little bit of complexity. Let's make the write some stuff function take an argument. So we'll go back here We'll add an argument called stuff. We'll just change the internals of the function a little bit so that it writes out stuff. Now this word here, stuff, this is an argument to the function, which is basically like a variable that only exists inside of the function. Like the only thing that can refer to it is code that's inside the function. That's the code between this curly brace and this curly brace. And the way you call this function is by doing this. So let's just get rid of one of these for now. And I'm going to write in here, I'll pass a string. I actually don't like apples. I don't know why I wrote that. Now we go and hit reload and stuff. I like apples. This is kind of cool. Astute viewers might have realized this by now. Console.log is a function, and we've been calling it this whole time and passing it an argument. We've been passing it an argument. We've been passing it what we want to show up in the console, a string. Now, if we go to the console, you'll actually be able to see this. So I go here and I type of console.log, and you can see that it is a function in much the same way that write some stuff is also a function. Let's go a bit further now, and we'll make that tipping function that we talked about earlier. So this is going to be a little bit more complicated. Let's define a new function here. So let's just get rid of all of this stuff, and we'll call it calculate tip meal cost. The curly braces here, everything between them is the code of the function. We go here and we're going to say let tip size equals meal cost times 15%. And we're just going to write out some quick log statements here. Console.log, the meal cost was meal cost. Go. Let's write out the tip. Should be, and we'll call tip size. And then the total cost is, Before we run this, I just want to point out that you may have noticed that I used a variable in here. Let tip size equal the meal cost times 15%. What I did here was I declared a variable inside the function. And the interesting thing about that is, like the argument here, meal cost, tip size only exists within the function. This is called scope. And it means as soon as the function ends, that variable ceases to exist in the function. To give an example of that, let's just call the function. So calculate tip, and let's say that the meal was exactly $10. The meal was $10, the tip should be $1.50, the total is $11.50. That's about right. Now, if we go in here and we try and use tip size, so console.log tip size. You might think, because the tip size was 1.5, that this is going to log 1.5. But in actuality, tip size is not defined. As I mentioned, tip size only exists for the duration of the function. That's when the function starts and when it ends. It gets created right here, and it only exists for a short time before going away again when the function ends. That's when the variable goes what's called out of scope and no longer exists. Let's get rid of this. And we'll add a second argument to the tip function now. Let's call it drink cost. So the reason I added a second variable is you can notice that I just used a comma to declare it. I didn't have to do anything fancy. All I have to do is add a comma and then the name of the next argument. And the way that we call this is we go to calculate tip and we just added a comma here. And let's say that the drink was $5. You got a fancy juice or one of those sparkling waters, and then we run it. Oh, we actually have to modify calculate tip to take that into account. Now we go. And there we go. The meal cost was $15. That's 10 plus 5. The tip should be $2.25. The total is $17.25. That's exactly what you should expect. Now, the last thing I want to cover here is that a function can do some work, but you can also get JavaScript to return a value from a function. Maybe you don't want to just calculate the tip and then print it out, but maybe you want to get the number so that you can add it up for everyone at the table. Let's modify the function yet again. So first off, I'm just going to simplify this a little bit. Just going to get rid of this so I can get rid of these. And what we're going to do here is we're going to return the value. So now, the return keyword is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, much the same way that function and var and Latin const, those are all reserved keywords. This is a reserved keyword. It tells JavaScript that you want to save the value, in this case, tip size, and you want to pass it back to the spot that called the function. Now, when I call this, nothing happens, but I can use the value and then it'll show up. So let's go and do that. Let's just print it out. So if I do a console.log and hit reload, we should print it out. There we go, 225. And you can save it. So instead of using console.log, let's save it to a variable. Go here, we remove this. Now we'll call this again. So let's go here. Let tip2 equal calculate. And let's say the second meal is $20 and they didn't have anything to drink. And we'll do some console.logs here. .log tip1. Oops. Now let's go to Chrome and reload. And there we go. You can see tip 1 was saved, $2.25. Tip 2 was saved, $3. So the total tips was $5.25. And those were written out here. So we have a console.log that writes out tip 1 and tip 2. And then we have a final console.log that writes out the combined tip 1 plus tip 2. Now earlier I said there were multiple ways to define a function, and there are. The one that we've been using up until now is called function declaration. So that's use the keyword function followed by the name and then all the arguments and the body of the function. But there's a few other ways. I'm going to go through a few of the others just for completeness sake now. So you'll know they exist, you'll know roughly what they do. And if you want, I encourage you to modify the examples in this tutorial and try to use the other ways of declaring a function instead of the function declaration way. So another really common way is to use what's called a function expression. I'll get rid of all this code to start. And it looks like this. This is called exactly the same way. Nothing really changes. Let's just go and write more stuff. And then go and reload and writing more stuff. So going over this a little bit, we have the function keyword here, and there's no name after it. This creates what's called an anonymous function expression. It doesn't have a name, but since we assigned it to a variable, that's the thing you can do, you can still refer to it by using write more stuff. And you can see that this is still a function. We'll just use console.log type of write more stuff. And there you go, it's still a function. In this example, we created what was called an anonymous function expression. You can also create a named function expression. So I'll just go here and I'll copy this. Now let's hit reload. You can see that it wrote more stuff again, this time from named. So we got writing more stuff, function, writing more stuff, function. The type of write more stuff and write more stuff again were both functions still. This is called a named function expression. And one of the major differences between it and the anonymous function expression is that it has a name, as you can probably tell. The reason that you give it a name is because if you have an error in your code and it's in a named function versus an anonymous function, you may just have a little bit more information about what happened. So sometimes it's useful just to give it a name, but you don't have to. Now, if you're wondering here what the difference is between the function expressions and the function declarations that we're using throughout the tutorial, the really big one is this. So I'm just going to get rid of a lot of this stuff. We're going to keep the anonymous one for now, and let's go here. And I'm going to declare a function the way that we were declaring it earlier. Function this exists. Now, from the name, you might be able to tell what's going to happen, but I'm going to run it here. So I'm going to call the function. This ran successfully. Now, the really interesting part is I can put it before the function declaration. And it still works. And the reason for that is because this function, this exists no matter what, exists as soon as the file is loaded and parsed. Now, if you try to do that with the function expression, you go to write more stuff here and you try and use it before it was created, this is going to error out. Because in the second case, in the function expression case, the function only exists after this line of code is hit. That's the biggest difference between these two. And yes, there's other reasons why you might want to use one or the other, but let's just ignore that for now. We're getting into an advanced topic, and we'll get to that down the road. Lastly, there are what's called arrow functions. Let's just get rid of the code here and let arrow function equals we go and reload. Oops, didn't run it. When we reload, we see I'm an arrow function. This is really similar to the function expressions. In fact, you actually have to go and assign it to a variable, just like a function expression, if you want to save it. For the sake of simplicity, you can consider them basically to be the same thing. That is, arrow functions and function expressions. There are differences between the two, but we'll have to do a much deeper dive on the differences later. So here's a challenge. Were you able to change the code to use function expressions or arrow functions? Let me know if you did and which one you tried. And that about wraps up this video in the series. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers.